So as Nicola has indicated, this will be a fantastic session, not the least because its participants are so distinguished. So they include not only Neil Lewis and Jeff Brower, but the session will close with remarks by Nicola himself. So as Nicola mentioned, I have been working on the Richard Rufus project for some time, and at present the Richard Rufus project is looking for a research associate to supplement the work that Neil and I do on the Richard Rufus edition. So Neil is a great expert, of course, on Richard Rufus, but also on Robert Grosseteste. He is the author of articles not only on Robert Grosseteste and William of Auvergne, on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but others. So with that, let me turn the session over to Neil.
Thank you, Rega. So before I start, I would like to just make a mention that the Georgetown University, where I work in Washington, D.C., currently has a position open for the Martin Chair in Medieval Philosophy. This is a senior appointment, the level of full professor. We're accepting applications from people who are at that level or advanced associate professor level. They close to be guaranteed consideration. You have to apply by November 30th. You can find information at Fill Jobs, but I'll just put in a a link here where you can get in contact with me if you have any interest in this position. This was the chair that Mark Henninger previously occupied, but it's now open not just to Jesuits, but to all human beings. And we're interpreting medieval philosophy to include medieval philosophy in Arabic and Jewish traditions as well. So we welcome applications if you are interested in this position. So with that said, I'd like to talk today about a certain approach to prime matter and quantity in Grosseteste, Richard Rufus, and Robert Kilwardby. And I notice we have some very major contributors to discussion of these issues with Sylvia Donati and both of the two Cecilias here. So I hope I don't put my foot in it, so to speak. In any event, let me go. I'm going to try to develop a sort of a hypothesis about influence here, and in the process say a few things about the doctrines in these authors. So in the De Ortus Scientiarum, a work thought to have been written between about 1246 and 1250, Robert Kilwardby mentions two theories regarding prime matter, giving the impression that they were the main contenders in his day. Both theories take prime matter in itself to lack dimensions. In addition, the first theory does not posit prime matter in itself to have parts. By contrast, the other theory, of which Kilwardby identifies two versions, attributes parts to prime matter in itself, but they are not parts outside of parts. And this is why, although prime matter, according to them, has parts, prime matter in itself lacks dimensions and extension, since these require parts outside of parts. The first theory holds that continuous quantity and dimensions are caused by the infinite replication of prime matter. The second theory holds that they're caused by the rendering distant from one another of the parts of prime matter. Notably, neither theory takes prime matter in itself to be some kind of formless, indeterminately extended stuff, as, for example, Jeff Brower, if I'm right, has suggested Aquinas holds, and Marilyn Adams attributed a view along these lines to Ockham. When I read this account in Kilwardby, it struck me the idea of infinite replication of prime matter is also to be found in two earlier authors, Richard Rufus of Cornwall and Robert Grosseteste. And I don't think this is mere happenstance. To start with, the term replicatio in its various forms and in this metaphysical context is not at all common, at least before around 1250. And there's reason to think Kilwardby had Rufus's theory and his scriptum on the metaphysics in mind. And Rufus, in turn, may well have been influenced by Grosseteste, although their views on prime matter also differ in significant ways, no doubt in part because, unlike Grosseteste, Rufus is heavily influenced by Averroes. Prior to Kilwardby, so far as I've been able to tell, and I certainly welcome corrections on this, Rufus and Grosseteste, the only 13th century authors to speak of the infinite replication of prime matter. It's possible, of course, that the idea is to be found in some hitherto unstudied work or works from the same period, perhaps influenced by one or more of these authors, but at this point, we shouldn't multiply sources without necessity. I don't know where Grosseteste got this idea from, if it was not his own invention. It's not to be found, so far as I can tell, in two authors who are known to have influenced him, Avicenna and Avicebron. So what I'll do here is consider the possible relationships between these authors on the issue of the infinite replication of prime matter. In the course of doing so, I hope to throw a little more light, more broadly, on the theories found in Rufus and Grosseteste. In this latter regard, I make no claim to be particularly original. Sylvia Donati and Rhaegar Wood have both discussed Rufus's views on prime matter and his definitions of quantity in terms of infinite replication, and Grosseteste's views on prime matter have been discussed before at some length by our worthy leader, Nicola Poloni, and by Cecilia Panti, as well as by myself and others. Even so, I think I have a few new things to add, and no one's looked at these authors specifically from the perspective I'm interested in. So I'm going to start with Grosseteste, move on to Rufus, and conclude briefly by examining reasons for thinking Kilwardby had Rufus in mind. I don't know if Nicola has done this. Yes, he's put the words, Neil's hand out for this. Oh, there it is. Okay, so there is a handout here. I am not, it's just text, and I may have cause to pull it up at some point, but at the moment, I'm not going to. So I'm going to start with Grosseteste. Grosseteste touches on prime matter or first matter in a number of works that probably date from the 1220s. The central text of De Luce and his subsequent commentaries on the posterior analytics and the physics. Prime matter in De Luce and in the commentary on the physics is considered in the broader context of his so-called light metaphysics, but that theory's key identification of the first corporeal form, corporeity, with light is not mentioned in the commentary on the posterior analytics, although first form and first matter are. There's also brief mention of prime matter in a work De Motu Corporale at Luce, a work I think Cecilia thinks predates De Luce. Am I wrong, Cecilia? Yeah, with which I agree. And in another work called De Operationibus Solis, a work that seems to me to postdate them, since it shows engagement, in my view, with Averroistic ideas not present in the former works. And although prime matter or first matter is also mentioned in Grosseteste's later Hexameron, I agree with Cecilia that the notion is understood there in a quite different way than it is in any of the aforementioned works. So let me just start with a very brief remarks on De Luce. In De Luce, Grosseteste starts with the assumption that there's a first corporeal form, corporeity, and that the extension of matter in three dimensions of necessity follows from it, consequitur. Here we might note an ambiguity in what consequitur means. Does it just express a logical relation so that possession of corporeity just is to have three dimensions? Or does it mean that extension in three dimensions is something produced by corporeity, but not strictly speaking to be identified with that form? In my view, it's the latter. Now, Grosseteste expressly takes corporeity and matter to be simple and lacking dimension. The puzzle is how we could get dimensions then. And Grosseteste thinks this is due to the first form, by the forms multiplying and diffusing itself instantaneously in every direction. It thereby extends matter in its diffusion of itself, since form cannot leave matter behind and matter cannot be devoid of form. Since light has this property of instantaneous self-multiplication and diffusion, Grosseteste identifies corporeity with light. He speaks of the multiplication of a point of light and goes on to hold that his account gets at what was meant by those who spoke of lines as composed of points, surfaces of lines, and bodies of surfaces. Although in this opening part of De Luce, he does not expressly refer to prime matter or first matter, it's clear that he has this in mind, since a little later he describes light as the first form created in prime matter. In the material I've just been considering, the notion of replication is not to be found. Grosseteste speaks of light as infinitely multiplying itself and diffusing itself and stretching out. Even so, there is one brief reference to replication in De Luce, where he writes that the extension of matter couldn't be made by the finite multiplication of light, because a simple finitely replicated doesn't generate a quantum or amount, as Aristotle showed demonstratively. So even in De Luce, the idea of infinite replication, I think, lurks, but it's only in the later commentaries that the concept of replication takes center stage. And note that the passage I just mentioned, he's making clear that to get quantity, you have to have infinite replication, because just the finite replication of simple prime matter in first form will not generate quantity. Another feature of De Luce struck me is that he only speaks in this work of extension in respect of matter. Light is said to be multiplied and diffused and stretched out, but it's not said to be extended. It seems to be a change of the way he expresses himself in the later works on this point. So let me now go on to the commentary on the posterior analytics. And in this work, he notes how elsewhere he's explained how a line's from the infinite multiplication of point and how it isn't. This is surely a reference back to De Luce, where he took the infinite multiplication of a point of light to result in the extension of matter, and where he held that in one sense the line is composed of points, and in one sense, allegedly Aristotle's, it is not. The line has points as parts, that's Grosseteste's view, but not as aliquot parts, which is the view he attributes to Aristotle. He proceeds to note in this commentary, but in one sense we may take points to be material causes of a line, and another as formal causes, in that they're limits of the line. And he notes that they define what they're causes of. So he may be alluding to definition of a line as what flows from a point, material definition. The other definition you find in Euclid of a line as a length without breadth, whose extremes are 2 points. In this passage, he speaks of multiplication, not replication, but I think that's because the object of his cross-reference, De Luce, speaks in this way. Later in the commentary, Grosseteste comes to the passage in the posterior analytics where Aristotle distinguishes a unit from a point. The unit's a substance without position, while a point is a substance to which a simple position superadded, and he's concerned to explain this. Speaking about a unit of number and its substance, a number is the same as replicated, but made one another by the replication. This reference to numbers in replication, as Chiliapantes noted, is frequent in Grosseteste, and I think that his use of the notion of replication in his account of the generation of extension probably has an ultimate source in this. Now, Grosseteste goes on to hold that a unit's the essence that's replicable in respect of itself, and he introduces the idea that replication is a kind of begetting. And this is an important aspect of the notion of replication, and it's also found in the physics commentary, and it seems to indicate that replication involves a peculiar mode of generation. What is the essence that's replicable? It's the nature of prime matter in first form that's in itself simple, and an essence that in respect of itself has a replicable nature. when this same essence has an indivisible position over it, it's a point. When it has a divisible position over it in one dimension, it's a line, and two, a surface, and three, what he calls a corpus quantum. Now, it's interesting that in this account of what a point is, that he seems to equate it not with form alone or matter alone, but with the composite of them under an indivisible position. And it's this very item that when it has a position divisible into three dimensions over it is what he calls a corpus quantum. I want to suggest a hypothesis here. When we look at the physics commentary, it's clear he's working with a distinction found in a number of authors between corpus substantia and corpus quantum. This distinction seems to have risen in light of the problem that Aristotle seems to place body in the category of substance and also in the accidental category of quantity. But how can the same thing be both a substance and an accident? The solution was to make a distinction between the use of body to refer to a substance, which in Grosseteste's case is the composite of prime matter and corporeal form, body as substance, and the quantified entity, body as quantity. And I think that for Grosseteste, corpus quantum is the product of the infinite self-replication of corpus substantia, a replication affected by the formal component of corpus substantia, namely light, corporeity. And this perhaps explains why Grosseteste speaks not just of matter being extended here in this commentary, but also of form. For in reality, the item extended is the form-matter composite. Indeed, in this work, he speaks of both prime matter and first form as extending themselves into magnitude and position, whereas in De Luce, it's a matter alone that is said to be extended. It is odd to say that matter extends itself, since Grosseteste consistently takes matter to be entirely passive. It's not odd if to speak of prime matter and first form as extending themselves is just a way of making the point that the form-matter composite extends itself, this in virtue of the active power of the form and the replicability of prime matter. I think the corpus substantia, corpus quantum distinction also opens up the conceptual possibility of body devoid of extension, dimensions, or continuous quantity. And this is one reason I don't want to collapse corporeity into actual three-dimensionality. Although Rufus is not using this terminology, he does posit the possibility of an actual human body without quantity. So people are doing that in this period. So let's now turn to the commentary on the physics. Here, as in De Luce, but unlike the posterior analytics commentary, he does present the idea of first form as light, and he holds, and I quote, "From simple matter, there would not come to be things with extension and perceptible magnitude, except through the infinite replication of matter over itself. And this replicability of matter is a passive potential. But in perceptible things, there's also the active infinite replicability of form, just as a passive replicability from the part of matter. For form, namely light, infinitely replicates and multiplies itself so as to extend itself into dimensions while at the same time seizing matter with itself. This sounds much like the study of De Luce, save for the fact now that the notion of replication has taken center stage, and now light or form is expressly said to extend itself into dimensions, whereas in De Luce only matter was said to be extended. The physics commentary has a bit more to say about infinite replication than the other works. The implicit reference, in my view, to the corpus substantia, corpus quantum distinction in the posterior analytics commentary is verified, I think, in the physics commentary. Grosseteste at one point is interested in the question of the sense in which corpus substantia, and he uses this word, is the same in the different parts of a continuum, a body. And this is very puzzling because the body as substance, the corpus substantia, is the form-matter composite, and merely as such is devoid of quantity. If it were as such to have quantity, then there'd be a magnitude substantial to body as substance in addition to the quantity that is an accident. And Grosseteste doesn't wish to adopt this latter view. How then does body as substance relate to these parts of the continuum? This was, I think, a puzzle implicit in the passage we looked at from posterior analytics commentary. How does the essence, that is the form-matter composite, relate to the corpus quantum? And that commentary tells us that it's infinitely replicated under position in 3 dimensions. And likewise in the physics commentary, where he's now especially using the notion of corpus substantia, he tells us, again, the key to the problem is the idea of infinite replication. It says first matter and first form by their infinite replication themselves beget corpus quantum. And he now tells us there's a peculiar mode of sameness with diversity in the case of the begetter and the begotten in the case of replication. He writes, in the way in which the substance of a begetter is in some way one in all things begotten by it, so the essence of first form and matter is one everywhere in a body, yet by the infinite replication of itself, it's made infinitely one in another, just as those who are begotten are from the begetter and from one another. Grosseteste, we may note, sees this peculiar mode of sameness and diversity of begetter and begotten found in the replication of body as substance to 2 other problems, how the now is the same and diverse, and the unity of universal in particulars. I won't go into that material because I don't have time, but what he seems to be grasping for is something that finds a place, as it were, between strict numerical difference when body as substance replicates and mere specific difference or difference in kind. And this he thinks gives him the way to explain how body as substance can be present in the different parts of a continuum while avoiding the need to posit a non-accidental quantity possessed by body as substance. He doesn't want numerical difference, it seems, because then something would be made anew and created from nothing, a prerogative of God alone. When he talks about light in various works, he emphasizes this point that the propagation of light doesn't involve creation from nothing. It's interesting that Fishacre, when he came to talk about the propagation of light, had the rather peculiar view that as light propagated, God had to remake the matter from nothing continuously through the course of propagation. And Rufus, discussing this in his sentences commentaries, Oxford commentaries, wrote, he said, "I don't find this pleasing." In any event, Grosseteste doesn't want to have any doctrine that would involve creation of something from nothing, or even something new, that there's not something new made. So he's trying to find something that fills the gap. And I go on to talk a little bit about how you might think the Aristotelian doctrine of moving from potency to act would play this role. But it turns out that in the physics commentary, Grosseteste wants to explain the Aristotelian doctrine of the movement from potency to act in terms of infinite replication, or not infinite, in terms of the replication of form. So the idea of replication in Grosseteste, this was his grand plan, which was not ever really implemented, was to take the notion of replication as the fundamental notion for explaining generation of various kinds. So he had that thought, but it never got developed. So let me now turn to Rufus. I'm mainly concerned with his remarks on prime matter in his scriptum on the metaphysics, which is a very large exposition plus questions commentary that the Rufus project, in disagreement with Timothy Noon, in a disagreement we explain in the introduction to our forthcoming edition of the first 6 books. We take the work to have been composed in Paris around 1237-38, just before Rufus left teaching the arts at Paris to enter the Franciscan community at Oxford. Noon, by contrast, took it to have been written at Oxford in the 1240s. I'll also briefly consider a short questions commentary on the metaphysics by Rufus, which we call the Memoriale after its opening words, that the project believes to have been written at Paris in the early 1230s. This work bears a number of very close parallels to the scriptum. The scriptum was an important early influence on subsequent thought in England, as evidenced by its use by Adam of Buckfield and Thomas of York, as well as on the content, judging by Albert the Great's use of it. Rufus treats prime matter at some length in the scriptum and employs in his account of quantity the notion of the infinite replication of prime matter. I hypothesize that this latter aspect of his thought was influenced by Grosseteste. Of course, he has a lot to say about prime matter, whereas Grosseteste had relatively little. You have basically all the things Grosseteste has to say in the handout. And unlike Grosseteste, Rufus is heavily influenced by Averroes. So there's a lot in his treatment of prime matter that has no connection to what we find in Grosseteste. Even so, I think that from his scriptum on the metaphysics, and if I'm right, ultimately from Grosseteste, the idea of the infinite replication of prime matter spread directly or indirectly to later writers. You find it, as we'll see, mentioned in Kilwardby, but it's also mentioned briefly in Thomas of York and in the Summa Philosophiae, attributed wrongly to Grosseteste, and Geoffrey of Aspal mentions it. So before we consider Rufus's views, we might ask how much knowledge of Grosseteste's writings he had by the time he wrote the scriptum. And the answer seems to be not as much as hitherto had been thought, but more than anyone else in this period is known to have had. In particular, there's no reason to think he'd read De Luce. In fact, this work seems to have been unknown in the 13th century, though it's used by Bradwardine and Nicholas of Arem in the 14th. Cecilia Panti may be able to correct me on this. She knows the most about the use of De Luce. However, in the scriptum, Rufus quotes at length from the later recension of Grosseteste De Libero Arbitrio, and the only other author known to make early use of this work was Richard Fishacre in the 1240s. And he also shows knowledge of Grosseteste's commentary on the physics. To start with, in Book 10, he raises the question of how, if there existed only a single line, its size could be known. And he says, well, it couldn't be known by an aliquot part, since that would require knowing the size of that part, and the problem is just going to reappear. How, the line is 3/3 lines long. How do you know the length of the third? And if you compete this kind of measuring, you probably just get infinite regress. And he then goes on to mention the solution of someone that God measures continua by counting the infinite indivisibles in them, and that this mode of measuring is available only to God, to whom the infinite is finite. These texts are on the handout. These remarks indicate that Rufus knew of Grosseteste's treatment of measurement in his commentary of Book 4 of the Physics, where the problem of the measurement of a solitary existing line and the solution in terms of God's knowledge of infinities of indivisibles are presented in very similar terms. I know of no mention of this material by anyone in this period besides Rufus. Later in his Oxford lectures on the senators, around about 1250, Rufus doesn't paraphrase this material as he did in the scriptum, but instead quotes verbatim from Grosseteste's commentary. It's conceivable that Rufus learned of this material at second hand, but since he clearly read one work by Grosseteste, it seems to me that he probably read the other two. Did he have access to the commentary on the posterior analytics? I'm inclined to think he did, though the evidence is somewhat weaker. There is a line in the scriptum where he talks of magnitudes as quodam modo numeri, and this is a reference to a passage in Aristotle where that language is not used, but it's very close to what we find in Grosseteste, who uses the same expression. Moreover, his account of points and lines has some close similarities to Grosseteste's account in the posterior analytics commentary, though there are also interesting differences. Parallel material is to be found also in the earlier Memoriale, and so if this material betrays use of the posterior analytics commentary in the scriptum, presumably Rufus also had access to the posterior analytics commentary when he wrote the Memoriale. And here I will just pull up the text, which is at the end of the handout. Don't ask me why it's there. Well, the reason it's at the end is because I decided to put it in after I'd made the rest of it. So that's a natural place for it to go. Okay, so these are the free texts. I'm not going to read these, but these are the texts I'm talking about. And so the concern is the distinction between lines and points that Aristotle makes in terms of substance that is and isn't under a position, a point and unit, respectively. There's no reference to infinite replication in Aristotle, but Grosseteste and Rufus both use it to extend these Aristotelian notions to the various forms of spatial continua. And in these passages, Rufus explains what numbers, points, and lines are in terms of whether and how the substance of matter, which seems to me here is referring essentially to prime matter in itself, is replicated under position. There's a clear parallel with Grosseteste's commentary in the use of the notion of infinite replication and the reference to begetting and position. though Grosseteste speaks of the position as above the replicated essence, whereas Rufus speaks of replicated matter as under position as its subject. One thing I'd note, it's notable that neither Grosseteste nor Rufus anywhere else in the scriptum makes any mention of prime matter in itself as possessing parts. I think this is because they don't hold that prime matter in itself has parts. If they did, it would be hard to see why they would accept the doctrine of quantity as the product of infinite replication. As Kilwardby mentions, there's a theory that takes quantity in matter as arising from spreading out the parts from one another in prime matter. Presumably, if prime matter had parts, while in itself lacking dimensions, it's this that would have to be done to produce quantity, not the replication of matter. Now, if there are similarities between Grosseteste and Rufus above in these passages, there are also clear differences, and the most striking is perhaps that Rufus simply mentions the replication of matter. Unlike Grosseteste, he makes no reference to form, let alone to first form, or to the form-matter composite. Another clear difference from Grosseteste, though to doctrine present in De Luce, but not mentioned in the Grosseteste 2 commentaries, that Rufus denies that points, prime matter under simple position on his view, are parts of continuous quantities, something Reger has written at length about in paper on points in Rufus. On this issue, he's an orthodox Aristotelian. And so far as the commentaries are concerned, it would be natural for a reader to take Grosseteste to have adopted this view too, because he doesn't mention it in these commentaries. This is not to deny that in some sense there's an infinity of points in a line, and Rufus holds that while a line is not made out of points, in some sense consists of them, rather obscure doctrine. Supposing he'd read this material in Grosseteste's posterior analects commentary, why would he omit reference to form in the passages above? And there's quite a few others like them. And the answer seems to be that he would do so because, unlike Grosseteste, he takes quantity not to be due to form. In his physics commentary, we've seen him, Grosseteste, refer to the first corporeal form as having the capacity to multiply and extend itself infinitely, and prime matter having the capacity to be replicated. He's clearly taking form as the effective source of the extension of matter. Assuming Rufus had read the physics commentary, he would have known of this material, but Rufus rejects this view. He takes quantity to be an effect in some sense of matter, not form. So in his account of the genesis of quantity, form does not as such play a role. And this is an issue he takes up expressly in the second book of the scriptum, where he asks whether quantity is an effect of matter. And he gives the argument that it's a per se accident and they're all caused by substantial form, so quantity must be caused by substantial form. And he rejects this argument and he replies. He says, first, he gives two replies. He says, we must say that not every accident is caused by a substantial form, rather an accidents that a passion or a acceptable quality is so caused. So these sorts of qualities in a composite are caused by substantial form. Hence, the commentator says that this authority, namely that every per se accident is caused by a substantial form, doesn't have a place in the case of unbounded dimensions. These are not caused by form. And he goes on and notes immediately after this, in another way, we may reply that in that authority, substantial forms taken in a broad sense to mean not only a nature other than the substance of matter, but also a potential of matter, which doesn't differ in its essence from matter. And in this latter sense, the proposition is true and universal, for the potential of matter with an agent causes quantity in the substance of matter. So it seems that from this passage, Rufus thinks that quantity in prime matter is caused not by a substantial form, but by a potential of matter and an agent. Just what this agent is not specified. Maybe there's more than one. But it seems that Rufus holds that prime matter gets to be replicated by the action of some agent on it, an agent not to be identified with a substantial form. This, so far as I've been able to determine, is the only place where he specifies how the replication of prime matter is produced. I'm going to skip how much time do I have, Reger? I can't hear you.
Not much.
Not much. Okay. What does that mean?
It means that in theory, we should be finished within 5 minutes.
All right. Am I going to have to summarize then rather than read So what I have a section that goes on briefly to talk about this issue of unbound or indeterminate dimensions and the difficulty of knowing exactly what Rufus's view on that is. It's a topic he takes up in book 11 explicitly. He's teaching on, it seems to me that in some sense he wants to adopt this doctrine, but he says things that are difficult to reconcile with it, and he has his final remarks on this are very hard for me to understand. So this is something, I don't think I've put this on the handout, but it's not an issue that Kilwardby talks about. So I'm just going to leave that. We can talk about this in the general discussion if people like. It's definitely an issue it's not taken up in Grosseteste, who's writing under the influence of Avicenna, not Averroes, where this doctrine seems to come from. So I'm just going to say that that the ideas concerning infinite replication and points and lines are repeated quite often in the scriptum. And Sylvia Donati has rightly observed in her discussion of this material, I quote, "The essential feature is account of quantity in the scriptum is its strong unifying attitude, according to which he reduces both discrete and continuous quantity, number and magnitude to one and the same genetic principle, matter." That seems exactly right. Rufus then actually goes on to give, I think these are on the handout, material and formal definitions of quantity in terms of notion of replication. And he goes on to hold that quantitative division doesn't apply to form, but to prime matter only. Forms are instead qualitatively divisible. Another doctrine that's repeated numerous times in the scriptum is the doctrine of the numerical oneness or unity of prime matter. Again, this reflects Averroes' influence. It's not to be found in Grosseteste's writings. And in addition, Rufus expressly holds that prime matter is present in all created substances, both corporeal and spiritual. Another doctrine, exactly what it means is not clear. It seems that he wants to make three claims: that prime matter is numerically one in an essential way, in which it can't be divided into different essences; in an accidental way, in that if it exists only under one form, it may be said to be accidentally numerically one, but if it exists under many, it's accidentally numerically many, and it's not numerically one in the way an individual is. And so exactly what these amount to is not obvious. There is a passage where he talks about the way that prime matter is accidentally many, giving the example of Socrates existing in the forum and the theatre, and that may suggest the possibility, and this would bear on how we then read the notion of infinite replication, that he has a view that prime matter is the sort of thing that can be multiply located, the self-same entity, much as some people have thought that, some realists about universals have thought that, the same universals multiply located. That's possibility. Kilwardby actually at one point in his discussion of prime matter says that he thinks that the doctrine of the numerical oneness of prime matter, denying that there is essential division, by which I think it means that it doesn't come in different kinds, is largely negative in nature, telling us what it's not, which of course leaves open many possibilities for what it may be. So I want to just move on quickly to Kilwardby. Very interesting discussion of prime matter in Day or Two, which is sort of weird. It sort of sticks out like a sore thumb from the rest of the work, which is about the classification of the sciences and so forth. And then you get this long discussion of prime matter, like heavy-duty metaphysics right in the middle of that. Obviously something he was interested in. And Sylvia Donati has written a very nice article explaining Kilwardby's views on this in the handbook on Kilwardby. So in the Day or Two, in two places, he summarizes an account of prime matter involving the notion of replication, infinite replication, and it bears striking resemblance to what we've seen in Rufus. In addition, he also constructs, as it were, a debate between proponents of this theory and the theory positing unspread parts in prime matter in itself, and he gives arguments pro and con. In a number of cases, the arguments against the replication theory and their replies have close parallels to what we find in Rufus, as does other material Rufus presents in giving his own view. And so what I want to do is present the hypothesis that Kilwardby, in fact, has Rufus's theory in mind, or if not him, then a theory of someone heavily influenced by him. These statements are on the handout. We can go up to, I'm not going to, these are just some parallels that look to me of interest. These are the statements, not yet there. Here they are. So these are the paragraph numbers from Judy's edition. So he says, talking about prime matter, is numerically one in all things according to this theory. And he says, I mean by numerousness of essence, that is, it's numerically one in essence, not by a numerousness of individual. It's not one in the way an individual is. It can be infinitely replicated under form of itself, and receiving numerous existence by a form coming to it, it causes discrete quantity if it's replicated under distinction, and continuous if without distinction, so that infinitely replicated in one dimension without distinction, it's cause of a line, 2 of a surface, 3 of a body, and from such an infinite potential and replication of matter, that theory says the infinite division of continuum is caused. This passage certainly brings to mind Rufus. We have the numerical oneness of prime matter in all things, that is universal hylomorphism here, in the sense of numerical oneness in essence, as Rufus also holds matter doesn't have the numerical oneness of an individual, infinitely replicated in one dimension and without distinction. It's the cause of a line and 2 of surf, etc. These are doctrines Rufus proposes, though the language of distinction is Kilwardby's edition. What he's getting at is when a form distinguishes, as it were, replicated matter, one thing from another, so you get discrete quantity that way. He does say that it receives it's replicated under form of self and receives numerous existence through a form that comes to it. That might suggest forms what serves to replicate matter, a view Rufus doesn't propose, but what Rufus Kilwardby seems to say here is that the matter causes discrete quantity if it's replicated under distinction and continuous without distinction. The form is not, it doesn't seem in this passage at least, the cause of the quantity. Rather, matter's being under the form gives the matter numerous existence. That is, the accidental numerical multitude, as it were. And Rufus certainly holds that existing under different forms, prime matter is accidentally many. And I think that's one way to read this. In any event, a little later, Kilwardby, describing the same views, much more circumspect, and his language indicates, I think, he's not quite sure how this theory accounts for the replication of prime matter. And he now offers the view that its proponents might perhaps, that's how he puts it, say it's a form distinguishing or else extending it. So a very understandable puzzlement, because there seems to be only one place where Rufus touches on this question of how prime matter gets replicated, as I noted above. The other passage where he presents the theory, I'm just going to end with this, is, and I write, this is here. It's numerically one in all things, so if you strip the matter in me and the matter in you of all form, and likewise the matter of any body and any spirit, when all forms are taken away, you don't find different essences or substances, but something through its essence doesn't have more or less, but a simple essence in potential to any forms. And when this essence receives specific and individual forms, it's not multiplied in respect of essence, but only in respect of existence. Nor as far as matter is concerned, is this multiplication anything but a certain replication of the same essence. And the essence is not made greater or numerous, but its existence, namely under forms, is made more numerous. Hence, nothing is added in respect of essence, but only in respect of existence. These thinkers don't hold that matter has parts substantially differing in diverse things or in diverse parts of the same thing. They hold that the whole essence of matter is everywhere differing implicitly only in respect of existence. So we find here the idea of universal hylomorphism, the view that the reception of form doesn't multiply matter in respect of essence, but existence. And there's also an echo of a passage in Rufus where he in fact uses the very example of stripping matter in you and me of all form. He writes, this is somewhere in the handout, I think. He writes, let every form, particular and universal, be excluded from matter, and nothing will remain except its substance, and let you understand it in this way shared in you or me. Therefore, matter in you or me is either numerically essentially other, or else it's not. And then he goes on to say why it's not essentially other. There are many other parallels between Deortu and the scriptum. In a number of cases, there are arguments found in material pro and contra views Rufus holds. They're at times close verbally, but I don't have time to enter into them now. So if the hypotheses proposed above are correct, then we see a line of influence regarding prime matter, beginning with Grosseteste, developed, though under different influences in Rufus, and among theories of prime matter, a prime contender, if I may pardon, by the time we get to Kilwardby. Thank you.